Hi, I'm Matt Sargent with ABC Acres. We're out here again in our high tunnel, and if you're wondering what's the cool filter on the camera, I'm pretty sure it's just how the high tunnel plastic, the greenhouse film, filters the light, and it gives me this beautiful soft glow. So that's the secret to good looking skin. Spend your time in a high tunnel. All joking aside, we're out here today to talk about one of America's favorite crops, tomatoes. They're delicious, they're fun to grow, they can be a little bit of a challenge, and we're going to talk primarily about pruning tomatoes. And any discussion about pruning tomatoes, before you really get into the nitty-gritty, you need to determine whether or not your tomatoes are an indeterminate variety or a determinant. We're growing both types in this tunnel, and we'll talk about pruning both, but you're going to use different techniques for both plants. So an indeterminate tomato, most heirloom variety, well, not most, but it's going to say on your seed pack whether or not it's determinate or indeterminate. Indeterminates tend to be more viney and put out a lot of suckers, and I prefer using a very hard pruning technique with them. And determinate types are more of a bushy type, and they'll set all their fruit at once, or 80% of their fruit at the same time, whereas the indeterminate ones, they're going to fruit all growing season. Once they start fruiting, they don't really stop. And then the other part about how you prune is going to be based off of how you're trellising. For our indeterminates, we're using tomato roller hooks that we got from Johnny's Seeds. As the plant grows up, if we need more line, as they hit the ceiling, we can spool more out, and that gets into part of how we prune. So all of our indeterminate types, we are pruning to 1 liter. In the past, when I haven't used roller hooks, especially with cherries, I'll prune them to 2 liters. But things can get out of control, and you're going to want a wider plant spacing. Since we're doing a single liter, we have these planted very dense for tomatoes, and that's also going to factor into how we prune them. Another important thing to keep in mind, whenever you're pruning, in theory, you should use a clean, sharp utensil. With tomatoes, it has to be clean. If you're cutting off any diseased parts of one plant and you don't have a clean knife and you move to the next plant, they're probably going to get that disease. And part of what makes tomatoes fun to grow is they can be a bit of a challenge because they are prone to a lot of diseases. All right, so now why we're all here. The actual pruning. Like I said, with these indeterminate tomatoes, we want to prune them to 1 liter. So wherever the vine is suckering, and if you look, you'll typically find suckers. This is a sucker right here. They grow out of the juncture of a leaf stem and the main stem. So you're going to take that sucker, and with your sharp shears or a sharp knife, you want to make a nice clean cut right through it and remove it. And now it's going to send more energy going up the main vine. And you can see this clip's in the way. There's another sucker right here at this leaf juncture. So while we're here, we'll go ahead and cut that. So one thing to keep in mind when you're pruning is you don't ever want to remove more than 30% of the plant at once. And it's been my experience, especially with indeterminate tomatoes, they can be very vigorous growers. So we're out here checking on them basically daily. We have a lot, so it's easy to get behind. We have a lot going on the farm. But if you let it go too long, if you're only pruning once a week, there's going to be more suckers than you can safely remove all at once. So I like to go through my tomatoes daily and remove the suckers. I also mentioned that we're planted kind of dense in here. Some of these leaves will grow out really long, and you don't want tomato plants touching. Peppers like to hold hands. Tomatoes, if there isn't good airflow, that's when you start seeing disease. So if the leaves start getting too long, because this will keep growing out, you can also prune, say here, and this way he doesn't reach out and hold hands with his friends. It's also important, in permaculture we practice a lot of chop and drop, and we like to save our biomass. Oftentimes these cuttings can become harbingers of disease. So Make sure all of your tomato prunings get removed off of the garden floor and either thoroughly composted in a compost that you're not going to plant tomatoes or other nightshades in, or take care of them in another way. I've burned them historically and used the ash as a fertilizer. There's a lot of different things you can do. Unfortunately, they're not really good feed as they're toxic. So there is that to keep in mind. Unfortunately, you don't get to see my beautiful face, but we've talked about with the indeterminate type, they're going to keep growing, and we'll be lowering this twine that it's trellised on as they mature. Down low here, there's no fruit. Our highest fruiting point is right here where we have the flowers. So anything below that point, the plant doesn't need. So depending on how much you have pruned already, keeping in mind you don't want to do more than 30%, you can come through and take some of those lower points off, just because that will encourage it to grow more and possibly put more energy into fruiting. And also, that way as we start playing line out of this trellis, and it'll make a coil down here, we'll have to, you know, it's something you have to finesse as you do it. You don't want leaves in contact with the soil. And since none of that will bear fruit anyways, or the fruit, by the time this fruit gets, or this leaf right here connected to the flower gets to where we've dropped it, we will have harvested all the fruit there. So that's how you prune an indeterminate tomato. Let's move on to the determinants. So the determinants are going to be a little bit trickier to show you because we've chosen to trellis them with the Florida weave. We will get in for a close-up here, but you can see these aren't as vigorous. I'm having to get kind of low to get in the shot. And they definitely can be way bushier and way more sprawling than an indeterminate tomato. So you want to space them a little bit further apart. And the main reason you're going to want to prune your determinate tomatoes is to keep good airflow to minimize disease, or your chances of disease. Lucky again, you don't get to see my face in this shot. Hopefully you can see what we're doing. But as I mentioned, with the determinants, we're just trying to create airflow. So the big thing is you want to remove some leaf matter to create better airflow, but you want to make sure that you're not cutting off your flowers, because that's where you get your fruit. So I've cleaned my knife, and I'm going to come through, and what we have been doing is we take off every other sucker. So there's a sucker that I just removed from this juncture. I'm going to leave this one, but we're also, make sure you can see that, hopefully. We're also coming through, and we're cutting some of the leaf points off. So just kind of, there's a little bit of a pattern. Part of it's a bit of an art, like pruning a bonsai, but we're just taking, you know, half of a leaf off here and there to create better airflow. With the small suckers like this, oftentimes you don't need a knife. You can just pinch them off if you catch them when they're small. And again, with the suckers on an indeterminate, we're taking every other, because we do want to promote that bushing activity. We don't want a central leader, but we also don't want them getting too out of control to where there's more leaves and make finding the fruits hard, and plants grow into each other and leaves are touching, and then we start getting fungal issues. So that is how you prune a determinate tomato. As always, thanks for joining us. We always love your feedback. Any questions or comments are appreciated. As you can see, we got a lot of tomatoes. I gotta get caught back up. So thanks for joining us, and until next time, happy growing.